Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Leslye Penelope. Hey, Leslye, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Leslye Penelope has been writing since she could hold a pen and loves getting lost in the worlds in her head. She's an award-winning fantasy and paranormal romance author. Her novel, Song of Blood and Stone, was chosen as one of Time Magazine's 100 best fantasy books of all time. Equally left and right-brained, she studied filmmaking and computer science in college and sometimes dreams in HTML. She hosts the My Imaginary Friends podcast and lives in Maryland with her husband and furry dependents. And I got to know Leslye because I was interviewing Jane Friedman for the podcast. And at the end of my conversation with Jane, I asked her if there was anyone that she thought would be a good match for the Indy Author podcast. And she mentioned Leslye. And then when I started looking into Leslie's background, I realized why Jane had made that recommendation. And any recommendation from Jane Friedman is good with me. So what we're going to be talking about is Leslie's move from indie publishing to traditional publishing to hybrid publishing. And periodically, I like having folks on the podcast who have experience in different approaches to the publishing voyage and can speak from first-person experience about how those different approaches compared. So, Leslye, I'm just going to ask you to just give us sort of the brief rundown of the progress of your publishing voyage through those different approaches.
Sure. Yeah. So my background, I studied film production and I had worked in independent film. So I was always a writer. And as I was working on my first novel, I was researching self-publishing. So I started writing that first book in 2013. And all along the process of writing, I was researching because I wanted to do it independently. I just wasn't convinced that traditional publishing would be interested in my story and that I wanted to go that route. So yeah, I published my first novel, Song of Blood and Stone, in January of 2015. And that year I published actually 3 more books, 2 short novels and another longer fantasy novel. And I really enjoyed the self-published route. And so what happened was I sent my book into Book Life for a potential Publishers Weekly review. And that's where independent publishers can submit. And if you're chosen, you can submit for free. And if you're chosen, they will review you in Publishers Weekly. And I ended up getting a starred review on that book. And that came at the same time that I won an award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. And so the book was getting some kind of notice and it was out there. And that same month, I got contacted by an editor at St. Martin's Press who had, I don't know how, she just come across the book through my marketing efforts or, maybe just through however it was, the press that it had. And she read the 2 books in the series that were available at the time. And at first she asked me to pitch her something new. What was my new series that I was working on? And I didn't have something, but I came up with a pitch within a few months, pitched her a new idea. But she eventually came back and was like, I really want to republish Song of Blood and Stone, this entire series, and see if we can bring it to a wider audience. And it hadn't really been on my radar. Self-publishing wasn't my second choice. It was my first choice. So it wasn't like I had gone through agents, been rejected the way there are people like that. So it was my first choice. And I hadn't even really considered going that route until this happened. So I thought about it. It meant taking my books off the market it ended up being a year because the traditional publishing process moves so slowly. But it ended up being a really good experience. And I knew even as I was signing that contract and going down that route, I enjoyed self-publishing. And so I wanted to remain hybrid and I wanted to still have certain things that I could do all myself, just live out all of my control freak tendencies on these books while still having the benefits that come alongside being traditionally published too.
Can you talk a little bit more about that decision of St. Martin's to want to publish a book you had already indie published? Because that sounds very unusual. Like every story that's floating around out there in the publishing world is that once it's published indie, a traditional publisher would not be interested in it. Can you just talk a little bit about what the publisher said to you that conveyed what their interest was and why they were willing to pursue that?
Sure. Yeah, it's not the normal route. You do hear of it happening here and there. I know a handful of other authors, but essentially it was a Black female editor at St. Martin's Press, and there aren't that many African-American editors in traditional publishing. And she'd come across the story and she fell in love with the characters in the story. And from her perspective, she wanted it to be in bookstores. She thought that she and the publishing arm there, one of the big 5, could present it to a much wider audience, bring it to more people, get it into bookstores. And that was the kind of story that she wanted to see have sort of a wider platform. And that was essentially it. I mean, she's a veteran editor, so she has a lot of leeway in what she wants to promote and publish. And I think that that's part of the reason why. I think that maybe a newer editor might not have had the clout to kind of pluck things out that have been in the marketplace already, because you're right, there is that idea that, well, it's in the marketplace. We don't want that. We don't want to touch that. We want something new and fresh. And that is the normal story. But there were just a combination of factors, I think, that led her to really want to take this story wider than a wider reach than I could have done on my own, which is actually what happened.
What changes did they make? I mean, I'm assuming they republished the cover, really created a new cover for it. Is that the case?
Well, they used my self-published cover. They made some tweaks.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. I had spent that in like an entire year just researching cover designers. So I ended up choosing a really fabulous cover designer who I love, who'd come from traditional publishing also. So they felt that the cover was still on brand. So they kept it for the original, for the hardcover edition. When we went to paperback, they actually did change the covers. But that first time, I was surprised. So they did license that for my designer. I did a whole edit with my new editor. So I had it professionally edited, the self-published version, but she had some more ideas and we did another edit. Actually, I did that book twice with them. So there was the hardcover edition that I did a whole rewrite of. And for the paperback edition, they wanted to do a special edition. So I ended up actually adding 40,000 words to the paperback, which was a whole nother writing process, which is another thing that you don't hear about very often, even in traditional publishing. So it's kind of like bring it out, like refresh it, new content, another reason to buy the paperback. That was the rationale behind that. But yeah, I did a big edit and I was happy to see the original cover kept, at least for the hardcover edition.
Yeah, that's a great confirmation of the approach that you had taken there. What kind of changes were they making in that first edit they did for the hardcover, traditionally published edition?
I remember that I got some notes about adhering more strictly to the hero's journey, which I kind of loosely kept to the hero's journey, but there was some tightening up there. So yes, the first note I got was on the hero's journey. And I remember restructuring some of the events so that there were more sort of try-fail cycles you hear about in craft. So my main character is trying to strive for this goal, but kind of getting beaten back. There's a little bit of reordering that happened in the first half of the book. So it was craft things for the most part, just strengthening some character development. And I think the ending was rushed. I do tend to rush endings a lot. So expanding a little bit on the ending, things like that.
And were the Song of Blood and Stone series, you had a couple of installments of that when the traditional publisher picked it up, and then you wrote more under the traditional publishing sponsorship? I always knew it was going to be 4 full-length novels and 3 novellas. And at the time, I had 2 novels out. And actually, the day that the editor came back and asked if I wanted to republish Song of Blood and Stone with them, I had just sent book 3 to my copy editor. So I was preparing to self-publish book 3. And it was literally that exact same day. So I held off, obviously, on publishing book 3 until I had made this decision. So the book had been out for a little over a year. It was about a year and 3 months at this point. And we finally signed the contract at the end of that year. So it was the end of 2016. And all of 2017 and almost half of 2018, the books were off the market. I pulled them off. And then it republished April of 2018, that first book. And they were basically a year apart after that. So I did the deal for the 4 full-length novels with them. And I kept my rights so that I could self-publish the novellas that I'd wanted to do in between. And so I did that. So the novellas have always been self-published and they're optional reading, but they're kind of prequels to the next full-length novel. They're usually happen at some point before, either a few hundred years before or right before. And so, yeah, the whole series as a whole is half traditionally published and almost half self-published. Were there any legal concerns of St. Martin's that you wanted to publish the novellas independently?
There weren't. I mean, I actually did the deal without an agent. I didn't have an agent at the time. I used a literary attorney to negotiate the contract and review everything. And so she was actually really great about ensuring that I maintained the rights to self-publish because she knew that was important to me. And I really didn't get much pushback. At one point, St. Martin's had at one point a digital first arm that was considering publishing the novellas, but that ended up not working out. And I was like, well, I'd much rather just keep the rights and do them myself. So yeah, the lawyer handled any concerns that might have come up, but it wasn't like I received a lot of pushback. It was like, this is kind of what I want to do. And they're like, okay, that's fine.
How about other rights like ebook versus print or audio or film? Were those all negotiated separately?
So usually traditional publishers want the audio rights, and they kept the audio rights. They sold them to Macmillan Audio. That's something that you used to be able to maintain audio more so than you are these days. Generally, you can keep your film and TV rights. You keep things like game rights, graphic novel rights. Those are kind of standard for the author to keep. So I did maintain TV and film, and I sold the audiobook rights.
And during this time, were you doing this with a day job, or by the time you got this deal, were you already writing full time?
I still don't write full time. I own my own business as a website developer. So I have reduced it since I'm self-employed to just a few core clients, but I still enjoy that. So I kind of still like to have my toes in that. So I was definitely having, and I was working much more. I was completely full time at my own business when this happened. And just over the years of publishing more and starting to replace more income with the publishing, that I've reduced my actual work hours.
You had said that there was a lot of the indie publishing activities that you enjoyed. Can you talk a little bit about what parts you wanted to retain, and were there parts that you ended up retaining part of, but that the publisher ended up picking up some of from you? Like, I'm thinking marketing and promotion as an example.
Well, for the traditionally published books, yeah, they pick up everything. So it's not like there's things that I can retain because I gave up much of the control. So even things like when the paperback came out, the new covers, which I think are beautiful, but I didn't have any input into those. And you give feedback, a lot of times they just don't listen to your feedback about things. So you just have to be okay with giving up the control and trusting that you're working with professionals who do this a lot and they don't have any sort of magic bullet, but that you're working with kind of publishing partners and business partners that will do a good job. And that's the gamble that you take and the risk that you take. In terms of marketing and promotion, I did have a publicist who I know was pitching to various outlets. And the way that I understand it is they can pitch to everyone depending on what their schedule is, I guess. But, they're not in control of who accepts it. And so which publications want to do an article or an interview or a review or something like that. So marketing efforts, a lot of it is giveaways. And throughout this whole time, because I started out self-published, I was still doing my own marketing efforts. And I was trying to supplement it as best I can. But it is very different because you don't get that feedback response. You don't know what things are working in terms of sales. You don't have, at least with my publisher, I know some are different. I don't have an active sales dashboard where I can see in real time what the sales are. I get royalty reports twice a year, and that's it. So there's no benefit to me running ads or anything like that. I can do social media, and I did things like pre-order giveaways and pre-order campaigns to try to increase the pre-orders and just stay visible and try to be out there promoting as much as I can. But knowing with traditional publishing, the way that you move the needle is hard to determine and harder to do because they're really focused on print and on bookstores. And those are things that I have very little influence on. Traditional publishers aren't so concerned about ebook sales. So I can try to use my efforts in that way, but the ebook is also very expensive. It's $13, $14 generally. So I sort of try to support my publisher as much as possible and still be as active as I can, but know that I don't know exactly what's going to move the needle and what's going to work. And there's only so much that I can do with those books.
Do you get the impression that even if they're sharing the sales numbers only twice a year with their authors, that they're tracking more closely? And can you tell by actions they take that, oh, it's been 2 months and now they're making a switch, one assumes, in response to the data they're seeing? Do you have any insights like that?
I do feel like that. I've worked with 2 publishers now. And I think that early on, especially because with traditional publishing, it's all about the early push. As the book ages, you're going to see less and less unless it's been hugely successful. And I'm definitely in the mid-list, so I haven't had any like amazing, huge spikes of sales success. But I do see things like different pricing promotions that they'll run if they think they can sort of capture sales. So for them, it's like, I think that they're submitting to Amazon for things like daily deals and gold boxes, and there's different types of Amazon promotions. I did get the idea that they are tweaking things in those first few months based on the data that they're seeing. Sometimes they will tell you, oh, the first week you did X number of sales, but that information becomes much more difficult to come by because they have so many different authors and they can't keep you up to date regularly. And And there was actually a situation where I was trying to find out my library numbers because I was involved in this group that was promoting libraries. And they never could tell me how many sales I'd had to libraries because that's not on your royalty reports. And that's some other department and it's embedded in other things. And so sometimes, even like with these big companies, they don't know exactly what's happening in every aspect of their own business, which is sort of strange to realize. But yeah, it's a huge company.
Well, I've always encapsulated, and I'm always tweaking this over time, but my condensed version of the difference between traditional and indie is traditional gets you access and bragging rights, the A and B. So like you're much more likely to see her book on a shelf in Barnes & Noble than I am. And of course, it sounds super cool to say that you're published by St. Martin's Press or any of the other big name. But one of the 4 C's of indie publishing is the care of the backlist. And it's an interesting perspective to know that traditional publishing is built to be focused on the more recent book, the time right after the launch. And then as time goes on, I guess it would almost be a decision by the author to say, do I want to spend the time and money and effort to promote backlist titles, knowing that the publisher may not be or is not focused on it anymore, and knowing that I'm earning money for myself, but I'm also spending money to earn money for them. Can you talk a little bit about that calculus and how that has played out for you?
Yeah, definitely. I have felt that after the first 6 months or so, definitely after the first year, when the returns start coming in. So it's traditionally publishing, they send books to bookstores, they sit on the shelves for a while. With fantasy, my books will be on the shelves longer than some other genres that have higher churn, but those books don't sell. The bookstore sends the book back to the publisher, and there's the returns, and you'll see that negative number on your royalty reports because they take it out of the sales that had happened. And so by that time, I do start to feel like the publisher's just kind of given up, like they're not doing anything else really. And that's disheartening. And for me, it's like, okay, these books are here, they're great. And if people find them, that's wonderful. But there isn't any, I haven't felt that trying to promote the backlist of my trad pub books would make any sense. Like I said, running ads doesn't really make any sense because who knows what's going to happen. Now, with the series, there would be book bubs for book 1 and maybe some pricing promotions for book 1 occasionally, but I haven't seen anything like that in a couple of years. And I finished the last book in that series came out, I guess 2021. And so, that series is done. They've moved on to all their new books and it's there. It's not out of print or anything. But at some point, if the sales drop, then it would go out of print and all of those things would happen. I think these days, they don't let things go out of print very often. It's a contractual thing. So it's like if your book doesn't sell 200 copies in the year, then or something like that. But at that point, they might do a sale and get some copies sold and so they can continue to hold the rights. But you do feel like the books kind of do get abandoned at a certain point. And I can still mention them and talk about them and hopefully word of mouth and kind of just trusting that as my new books come out, if I have a reader who really falls in love with it, then they will go and search out the backlist. And I do see that anecdotally happening. I'll get messages to that effect like, oh, I saw this new book that's being promoted by my new publisher. And I went back and I'm reading all the old books. And that's kind of just that's one of the things that goes on. So yeah, for me, I mean, I could post about it. I've thought about just posting to my list. New newsletter members might not have read my backlist. So I can continue doing those kinds of internal promotions. But as far as any sort of campaign or focusing a lot of energy on that, it's not something that I had thought about doing.
I assume that all your books must be such that a person can start in the middle of the series and read through. And if they pick it up at book 3, because book 3 is the new book that the publisher is pushing, that they can read through the remainder of, well.
I saw a review of book 3 that said people could start there. That is not how I wrote it. It really is. They're not standalones. It's not the same couple per book. Even their fantasy romance, this Ursula Chronicle series. So 1 and 2, I wrote as you could start either with book 1 or book 2 because they're parallel, but they really are a series and it's an overarching story.
That's really interesting. I never really thought about it in quite that way of what's in it for the publisher to purchase a series when they're not always pushing people to the first book, because that's what I do. I mean, I published my first Dan Kinnear book in 2013. That's what I primarily still promote. Right. In the hopes that people will read through, and each of the books can kind of be standalone, but they sort of make more sense if you read them in order.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to understand the business calculus of that.
they run their businesses so differently than we do as indies.
Yeah.
It's mystifying in some ways because like book 4 comes out, they're not really promoting book 1. I mean, you'd think they would discount it the way that we indies do, but maybe because the publisher's customer is not the reader. The customer for the publisher is the bookstore. And they're trying to sell the books to the bookstore. And so hopefully the bookstore would have all 4. So you'll see the series on the shelf there. That's not always the case. But yeah, if you think about who is the customer of a traditional publisher, and they don't have those tight connections with readers. Some of them are becoming better about that. And some publishers are better than others. I know Sourcebooks is very data driven. Some of the smaller, not big 5, but they're one of the big ones anyway. But in general, you have to think about that. Like, who do they care most about? And they're really pushing print and they're pushing it to bookstores.
It does seem like a business model that would lend itself more to being viable for standalones. It would be interesting to know how often a bookstore would have the entire set in-house, because you can imagine that they get book 1, there's a run on book 1, it gets to the end of this 6-month period or the year, they send back what's left, and then book 2 comes out. Although maybe you're publishing or an author's publishing more quickly, that they're staying ahead of that. But it's almost like you'd have to make sure you had a new book before that return window closed.
Which is hard.
Incent people to want to incent the bookstores to keep the ones that they already have.
Yeah, but the bookstore doesn't want to have too many of any, unless you're George R. R. Martin. They don't want to have too many of any one book. So I'll go into bookstores and I'll see out of the 4, they might have 2, they might have 3. Rarely do they have all 4, which in some ways it's good because ostensibly someone bought one of those books. But yeah, it does make it difficult to sell a full, complete series like that.
Well, I have to say that as long as I've been a student of the publishing world, I have never thought about it in terms of the customer of the publisher being the bookstore. That's really interesting. Now I'm going to be pondering that for days, because it does explain a lot of what they do, but also feels like it sort of highlights areas where they could change. Like when I started out, it was all about what can indies learn from traditional publishers. Then I think as time went on, we started seeing examples of the traditional publishers learning things from indies, like doing book clubs. But it does seem like something that maybe there's a lesson for traditional publishers there about the management of series and that they could benefit from.
I think so. I definitely think so. And just thinking about it holistically and thinking about readers more, thinking about really the end user of their product.
Yeah. And do you see or have you heard moves toward using more print on demand? Because I feel like if I suddenly got put in charge of one of the big publishers, I would make sure everything was always available in print by using print on demand, because I think that the printing up big batches is not only problematic from a supply and demand point of view, but also it becomes sort of ecologically problematic.
Yeah.
Any insights on that front?
I have not heard about that. I know my agent told me that when you sign the contract with your publisher, they're already ordering the paper because it takes a long time. And that book is going to come out in 18 months when you sign the contract. So they have these big machines, these big contracts in place. They've got warehouses and printer and presses and all of that stuff. And that, I don't know what the incentive for them is to change that, because that's huge infrastructure in place. So I haven't heard much about them moving towards a print on demand. Even for the ARCs, advanced reader copies, you would think something like that would be more susceptible to print on demand, but not that I know of.
Very interesting. So as you're looking toward the projects that are coming up for you, are you weighing the traditional indie choice? Are you re-weighing it for each new project?
I do. I think about the idea that I have and whether it is a better fit for indie or a better fit for traditional publishing. So things like the genre, like my latest book was this historical fantasy heist. And I felt like it was more of a fit for traditional publishing because it's crossing some genres, doesn't fit neatly into the Amazon categories. Whereas my latest self-published book is paranormal romance. It's like a futuristic, it's still a little bit cross-genre, but I felt like it was a little easier for me to promote using the mechanisms that we have available to us as indies. And that's usually my calculus for it. It's looking at the genre, looking at how would I promote this? How would I find the niche of the audience myself? Or is that something that would be easier in my mind to let the publisher handle that and worry about that? And how long does it take me? How long is the book? Shorter books are more, I would push them more towards indie. the longer books, thinking about just editing costs and proofreading costs and things like that, in addition to the genre. So there's a couple of different kinds of analysis that happen. But yeah, I do think about with each project, like, okay, I'm going to hold this back because I really want to do this myself, or I'm going to pitch this to my editor and see, or my agent, and see what they have to say about shopping that.
And you don't have any requirement of giving them right of first refusal before you would indie publish it?
The way my contracts work are kind of genre-based. So with the St. Martin's Press, that series was fantasy, historical fantasy. And I think we narrowed it down in the contract that my option with them was my next work of historical fantasy. That left me completely free to do my paranormal romance, which is usually contemporary, or this futuristic story that I published. And I think it's similar with the option that I have with my current publisher. So I try to keep the option narrow. And so in the exact genre that they already bought from me, so that everything else I'm open to indie publishing.
I'm curious, if you were talking with someone who was very early in their career, they were finishing their first book and they were making a decision about whether to indie publish or pursue a traditional deal, and they had heard your story about your background, are there things that you would say to them, this is the experience I had, and it's something that I can recommend to other people? And are there parts where you would say, well, this is the experience I had, but it's not representative, and so I wouldn't recommend that? Like, for example, the fact that a traditional publisher was excited about picking up a series you had already indie published. What advice would you convey based on the experience that you had, which in some cases was quite unusual?
Right. Yeah, I always stress that the way that I got published by the publisher was not the normal path. And so it's very little you can actually learn from that. I don't have the experience of pitching to agents in that way for people who want to go traditional. But I do talk about like what they want out of their career. Has it always been their dream to walk into Barnes & Noble or whatever the bookstore is and see it on the shelf, see their book on the shelf? And that's something that's just much more difficult indie. I mean, you can do it. You can sell it to your local stores if you can form relationships, and that's probably a good idea. But in general, it's a lot more difficult. And then libraries, like your print book in libraries. Did you always want an award in your genre? Like those kinds of things go into play. And although we traditionally hear that, oh, well, you can make more money self-publishing, for a lot of people, that's not necessarily true. Like I actually do make more money from my traditional contracts than the indie books. Part of that is because I'm splitting my time. So I'm not able to focus all on the indie books, create these big series that I can then promote in those ways. I spend a lot of time with my contracted books, and then I'm also indie publishing. But it's not the case that all authors are going to make goo-gobs of money self-publishing, even though you have more control and more ability. It's difficult to sell books. Both paths are very difficult. And I do try to stress they both have their pros and cons. I like both. I'm frustrated by both almost in equal measures. So it's really about what you're looking for, how much control you want to have, what your other skills are and interests. Are you interested in marketing? Are you interested in managing editors and cover designers and learning how to do ads and all of that stuff? Does that fascinate you, or does that make you run and hide with fear? So maybe let someone else do that. Like if you go the traditional route and someone chooses you, because you can't just choose that, someone does have to choose you, which is obviously the downfall, but other people do handle that. Now, how well they handle it, you're not going to know that either. So yeah, they both are different paths that have their own heartaches and benefits to them. And so I just try to make that really clear so that anyone choosing which path they're going to follow has information about both, and it's not sort of blinded by I think there's kind of zealots on both sides. And so, yeah, someone like a perspective like mine, even though my journey has been different, I can see both sides. And I try to see them really clearly for their benefits and their downfalls and just communicate that.
That's great. Well, so much food for thought. I'm going to have to ponder this. Who's the customer question? I think that's fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Please let the listeners and viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and all your work online.
Sure. My author website is lpenelope.com. And I do host a weekly podcast, My Imaginary Friends. And my site for writers is myimaginaryfriends.net.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.